the most advantageous market price? 90 or 95? 95? No, because what I said to you, which he picked up, is you consider those costs to determine the market, right? So the most advantageous market is Scotland, because the net price in Scotland is 80. The net price in London is 75. Once you determine that Scotland is the most advantageous market, when you calculate fair value, you exclude transaction cost. So the correct answer is 90. You got it correct, right? You said 95. Does that make sense? So the correct answer is 90. Now, if most products were sold in London, if that was the primary market, you would pick 95, right? If there's a principal market or primary market, you don't go by the most advantageous. Okay? Clear? Just one more aspect here. Valuation techniques. So there are different broad techniques to value. Any questions? Clear? Well, you picked, because where do you make the most money? Correct. But when you determine the most advantageous market, you pick, where do you get the best net price? Scotland. So when you select the market, you consider every single cost. Once you select the market to determine the fair value, you follow the principles in the standard. And those principles say you don't include transaction cost. So you've determined that the best place to sell is Scotland, because the best net of everything is 80. But 80 is not fair value. So the fair value would be the 100 minus the transportation cost, or 90. So 90 would be the most advantageous market is Scotland, and the fair value per IFRS 13 in that market is 90. So the mistake, so it's a two-pronged step. You use the bottom number to determine the best market, and then you use the IFRS 13 concepts to determine the fair value. Clear now? Because that's specific in the standard. Remember the very first slide?
But at the beginning you also said that we consider all items that are,
and the transaction cost is not. The transaction cost is a characteristic of the transaction, not the asset.
But the asset cannot be sold without transaction cost.
Right, but it's not a characteristic of the asset. So specifically in IFRS 13,
Then why was it important in the oil barrel example?
because that was transportation, and because the location is a characteristic of the value of the oil. Oil in Chad is not the same as oil in London, because the market is in London. And because the location is a characteristic, the transportation to get it to where you're going to sell it is a characteristic of the asset, not the transaction. That's why.
So in this case, we are not going to ignore transportation costs?
Well, I'm assuming that transportation cost is a characteristic of the asset because the location affects the price. So you're a farmer in the rural area, and the value of your asset is at these markets. So I'm assuming the location impacts the value. So therefore, I'm assuming that the transportation cost is a characteristic of the asset in my question.
But for part B, where London is the primary location.
Then you don't care about Scotland. Then you pick 95. Because fair value excludes the transaction cost. Because transaction costs are not a characteristic of the asset. They're a characteristic of a transaction. Just like in IFRS 3, right?
For both of them, we select London.
No, for Part A, you select Scotland. But it's a lower fair value, but it's a higher net value.
Yeah, but right now my objective is to fair value.
Correct. But to determine the fair value, the first step is to determine the market. And you consider everything. The common sense best place to sell is Scotland, right? So therefore, Scotland is your best market. Period. So once you determine the best market, you then apply the principles in IFRS 13, which are only asset specific. Does that make sense?
Basically, the most advantageous market is entity specific, while principal market is same for all. That thing we should consider.
Correct. Principal market is same for all.
While most advantageous is entity specific.
Correct. 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 Most entities are specific. Now, the next aspect is, I want to just a few more minutes, I want to get into IFRS 9, is evaluation techniques. So, the standard says you need to pick the valuation technique that gives you the most inputs from the market, okay? So you cannot pick a technique just because it's nice and easy, right? So, would it make sense to value buildings based on the cost approach? Would it make sense to do buildings based on cost? Why?
That's not that's more specific to you, what amount of cost you have incurred on that building.
But with the cost to reproduce it. The cost approach, sometimes it's called the depreciated replacement cost, is the cost to redo it. Would it make sense to value a building based on the cost approach? It depends, sure. I'll give you an example. So let's say I have a mine in the middle of Australia, and I have houses for my staff. And the only reason you live in this little isolated town is because you work for the mine. And the moment there's a weekend, what do? You get the heck out of there. So the only way to value that piece of real estate is say, well, what would it cost to build it again and adjust it for its age? So the point I'm trying to make is the method you pick should be the method that's done by the market. You cannot just pick a method. When I did some work in Sri Lanka, I worked in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago with the regulator there. They were very smart, a bunch of ladies that were basically checking all the companies on the stock exchange. And what they did in Sri Lanka is they wanted to value something. The valuers would say, okay, here's the cost approach, here's the market approach, and here's the income approach. They get three numbers and average them. Is that okay?
No.
That's wrong.
Wrong.
That means the valuation people there are incompetent. You cannot take three numbers and average them. Dead wrong. They were taking empty land. They were audited by one of the big four. What they were trying to do is get the value of the land up to get the share price up. Manipulation. So what they would do is say, if we build a hotel, we'll make a ton of money. We knock out the construction cost of the hotel. That's what the land is worth. Does that make sense? To value empty land? No. That's called fraud, right? So what they would do there is they do these funny income calculations.
Can be one of the valuation techniques.
Yes, but if there are other pieces of land that are selling, and there's a market price for vacant land, you can't inflate the land by building up some lovely cash flow projection that's rubbish. So the point is, the technique you pick needs to be one how someone in the market would do. Generally, real estate that is residential in a city, you would get comparable prices and use the market approach. Generally, real estate that is commercial, like a shopping center, you would generally look at the income approach. And generally, for equipment, say you're doing your purchase price allocation in a business combination, you would say, what does it cost to buy new equipment, age adjust it to get the estimated fair value? Or for buildings in remote locations for mining and farming and stuff, where there isn't, the building is there only for your purpose. You would probably say, what would it cost to build it again and adjust it for its age? If it's halfway through its life, take half of the value of a new one. So the point here is you cannot pick the method. That's wrong. The method has to be appropriate for people with industry expertise in that area. And that's the method you must use. Is that clear?
So what about if I take an example of a land plus building? Let's say we have let's take this example, Movenpick. We have a land and
in a major city.
Yeah,
okay.
Major city, but we don't have the active market available for real estate prices. So would we go for a replacement cost method, or would we go for?
I would have thought for a hotel.
Let's assume that there is no income generating. Let's say it's a factory. Don't take a. It's a factory. I won't take a Movenpick example. Let's take an example of a factory, because Movenpick has a hotel, so we might go for income approach.
Well, if it's a deserted factory that's closed.
Let's say if it's working.
Well, if it's working, then there should be a value. I wouldn't use the income of the factory, because the factory income doesn't mean it's the value of the building.
Exactly.
So I would probably use the market approach. And if there's no factories being bought or sold, the only other choice is what would it cost to build it again and adjust it for its age.
The replacement is the last method available.
Yeah.
And that must be the lowest value, I think.
Not always.
Depends.
Not always. Because sometimes in a depressed market, it's cheaper. Like, for example, I did some work in in UAE recently, and there's a big surplus of shallow water drilling vessels. So I don't know if you did, and off India there's a lot of drilling. I'm not sure of Pakistan, I'm not sure.
Not so much offshore drilling.
Shallow drilling, not deep drilling. There's two types of drilling. There's deep and shallow. And I learned this from my course. So I'm remembering how they told me. So basically what China did is they invested all this money to build 100 of these tankers to do shallow drilling. So it's where you don't go so deep, as opposed to deep water drilling where the boat can't connect to the bottom. And so China basically constructed 100 vessels. And then the problem is, because gas prices were suppressed, there's a huge glut of these vessels. So it's actually, the cost to build a new vessel doesn't make sense. So you have a situation now where the replacement price is much, much higher than what you could buy them for in the secondary market, because there's a glut. So replacement price doesn't have to be lower than the market price. It depends. In this case, there's a huge glut, and the market price was like half of replacement price. And then what will happen is, as these ships have a 15-year cycle, as they go out of service, the prices start to go up, and then there will come a point in time where new ones will be built. So it's not the lowest. You can't look at it like that. Everything depends. So valuation is a messy area. It's an area that I find in emerging markets, it's sometimes done very sloppy. I'm not sure how it's done in Pakistan has a high skill set. I know that. But in a lot of emerging markets, you find this area is subject to aggressive manipulation. Yeah?
If an asset cannot be sold in the market, then does it has a fair value?
Yes.
For example, when you were giving the example of those mining labor colonies or labor houses, they would not be eventually sold to anyone. They would be used and then would be vacated. Then those houses, does they have a fair value?
Well, there would be a hypothetical market, but yes. So generally, why would you value those mines? Generally, you would value those houses with the mines because of a purchase price allocation, right? So you bought this company, they have a mine in the middle of nowhere, you have to do a PPA allocation per IFRS 3, and the only way to do it is to use the cost approach. Now, could those houses be revalued under IS 16 and IS 40? Probably no, because IS 16 and IS 40 have a concept of reliability, right? but IFRS 3 does not. So the reason for the valuation would probably be a purchase price allocation. Could they be revalued under post-acquisition? No. If it's an IFRS 9 financial instrument, that's different. It doesn't have a limitation about reliability like IAS 40 does. So it depends. So remember, IFRS 13 is how. How to value anything. The other standards may limit when. When is not the scope of IFRS 13. So it's a pretty good standard, I think, that talks about how to, very, very principle-based, and it's in line with International Valuation Standards, IVA. So there are standards for valuers that they're supposed to use. And I'm sure here the standards are probably quite high. But in some emerging markets, the way the valuers do things is you say, oh my God, that's rubbish. So here I guess they're quite good, right?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I understand IFRS 13 is all about how to value assets, but from an IFRS 16 perspective, let's consider that example that he gave, that instead of this building, there is
IFRS 16?
IFRS 16.
Elise.
Sorry, IS. So I need to revalue this factory here.
You can't revalue it. It's not allowed if it's not reliable, though.
Sorry.
So, okay, continue. Sorry, go ahead.
So, say for example, this has become an area where a lot of residential properties have come up, but I'm the only one having a factory here. So, and also we saw a similar example in beverage company as well.
Okay.
So, the residential properties are way too high, and I am considering that can I sell or vacate this property,
Right.
relocate my factory somewhere else? Can I value this property based on residential market, or I must not, because my factory is like what my bread and butter is? So can I still revalue my factory based on residential prices?
Yes. You have to value the factory based on its highest and best use, not its current use. And if it's financially feasible, after demolishing the factory, it's worth more in aggregate. Demolished
I have no intention.
doesn't matter, irrelevant. Because IFRS 13 says it doesn't matter how you use the asset.
It is always valued from the aspect of the market participation.
Correct. You might take Guinness, for example. Guinness is a beer company in Ireland, and they have a factory in a very good location with a lot of houses around it. Maybe they have chose, because it's an iconic corporate symbol, they don't want to knock it down and build houses there. That's their choice. But the highest and best use might be to knock it down and do houses. So if you were to value it, it'd be based as residential if the numbers come out okay, irrespective if you never intend to knock it down. It's always highest and best use. You were going to say something?
Yeah. Just to sum it up, the concepts. In the older regime, the word impracticable to do so was frequently used when there were complex situations of
Correct.
evaluation.
In IS 39.
In IS 39, in I think 18,
as well.
In IS, well, IS 8,
as well, right?
IS 16, IS
Then
40.
there was another fundamental concept of measured reliability. These were the two words
Yeah, reliably measured.